Hello everyone, Max here with Fiction Rant, and coming off a cold, so apologies about my voice quality, to bring you part 2 of the Federation from Star Trek versus the Galactic Empire from Star Wars, a full breakdown with rules and different matchup scenarios. Also, I have links to my Patreon, Coffee, and Fourth Wall in the description if you'd like to support the channel. I'd like to do a breakdown just like this one for a matchup between the Protoss and Eldar, but I've been putting it off because it intimidates me, so I decided to host the discussion of the subject on my Patreon if you wanted to join the discussion there. Alright, on to the matchup. This will be part 2 of 8, where I cover the speed/mobility capabilities of each side. Again, this will be the Galactic Empire as of the Battle of Endor, except the Rebellion doesn't exist, versus the Federation as of the Dominion War. I will clarify further that Voyager hasn't returned with all of its sensor logs and looted tech, so the Federation won't be getting things like the slipstream drive, deployable armor, Borg tech, any of that stuff. Alright, on to the speed capabilities. Really, there are 3 main categories: faster than light, sublight, and terrestrial travel speed. I'll start with the easiest. On the ground, the Empire utilizes gigantic armies of stormtroopers supported by various armored walkers and speeders. These help move troops around while helping keep them protected and providing heavy fire support. They can move relatively quickly, but nothing is breaking the sound barrier or anything like that, except for TIE fighters, which are in the air, and that's kind of a gray area between space and the ground. On the Federation side, they use almost no ground vehicles of any kind, with the very rare exceptions, such as the Argo-class buggy we see in Nemesis. The Argo is speedy, but only carries like 4 people, and has minimal protection, while also appearing a whopping 1 time across all series. This is because, for the most part, Starfleet just relies upon shuttles and transporters to get around really quickly, at least based on what we see on screen. There are references to vehicles, but yeah, they're really never seen on screen except for like there's a weapons testing thing that Quark did during DS9, but it wasn't even a Federation speeder that was being shot at, that kind of thing. Basically, they don't use speeders as a rule, the Argo being more of an anomaly than anything. And, a fun opportunity for Picard to let loose with a dune buggy, essentially. Regarding transporters, these allow users to move between ships and locations in seconds with a range of around 50,000 kilometers. Also, you can say hi to my son, who I'm sure you can hear in the background. They're not totally unlimited and are blocked by things like shields or sufficient interference or certain materials, but when operating as intended, they're pretty much the ultimate mobility tool. I'll get into more of some of their other functions in the unique advantages section. Moving into space, I'll again start with the easy part: faster than light capabilities. In short, faster than light travel for the Imperials is way faster than anything that the Federation has at the time in question. Contrary to somewhat popular belief, Star Wars hyperdrives do not move ships at light speed, despite characters calling it that all the time. In context, light speed is a colloquial term, not a technical one. Unfortunately, light speed isn't ever actually quantified anywhere that is canon, and is instead as fast as the plot demands, but we can tell a bit based on what we get to see. As a general point of reference for overall speed, we can look at the trip from Coruscant to Naboo from Phantom Menace, which took the team approximately 40% of the diameter of the galaxy, which is about 120,000 light years across, in some relatively short amount of time. Let's call it a week. Given that info, we can pretty easily calculate that the Naboo cruiser with its class 0.8 hyperdrive was traveling at around 1.8 million times the speed of light. Oh, I should briefly explain. The smaller the hyperdrive class number, the faster the ship. So class 1 can do a trip in X amount of time, while a 0.5 can do it in half that time, and a class 2 needs double the time, and so on. Most Star Destroyers carry class 1 hyperdrives, so they're a bit slower than the Naboo cruiser, but not by much. There are, however, some downsides to hyperspace travel despite its speed. For one, it's interdimensional travel. You're traveling through hyperspace. This means that you're basically entirely blind while traveling and don't get to see anything along the way or at your destination until you exit hyperspace and everything snaps into focus. Departure from hyperspace also causes a massive energy surge, which is extremely easy to detect, as demonstrated by the incompetent Admiral Ozzel, who jumped Vader's fleet out of hyperspace too close to Hoth, alerting the rebels that they were there, when the smart thing to do would have been to drop out of hyperspace farther out in the system and then crawl the rest of the way at Sublight so that they'd remain undetected. Next, it's still influenced by some stuff in real space, mainly gravity wells, even artificial ones. This is why interdictors can pull ships out of hyperspace. They generate massive artificial gravity wells along routes that they're predicting some traffic will want to actually move along that they want to intercept, and that artificial gravity well then pulls any ships moving along that path into real space, and they can't then jump back into hyperspace. This also means that calculating jumps to hyperspace is a pretty time-consuming and computer-intensive process, so if you're needing to escape or something, you're going to have to survive long enough for your navigomputer to actually figure things out, as seen repeatedly with the Millennium Falcon. Finally, the limitations on hyperspace travel have led to the establishment of hyperspace lanes, which are essentially particularly safe regions of space that are relatively clear of navigational hazards. They're not constructs, and you can technically travel from anywhere to anywhere with a hyperdrive. You just might die in the process because you rammed a star on accident or something like that. Actually figuring out where safe navigation can happen is a very time-consuming and arduous process for the Imperials, so there's a lot of scouting goes on back in the day, back when a lot of those hyperspace routes were established. At least according to legends, you'd have Force sensitives being people that are scouting hyperspace routes because their level of awareness due to the Force kinda helped make it a bit safer. Those safe routes are why things like the Naboo blockade and Vader jumping straight on top of the Rebel fleet in Rogue One are actually possible without the use of literally millions of ships. The departure and arrival zones for a given planet are actually relatively small in cosmic terms, so if you can fortify that relatively small space, you can protect a world from invaders or prevent people from leaving, unless they get particularly reckless and risk blowing themselves up in transit. The implication seems to be that that risk is great enough that people would rather tank a hail of turbolaser fire from a massive capital ship and fighters rather than just blasting off in a random direction for a few seconds. Moving on to the Federation. Unfortunately for them, at the time in question, fancy drives like Slipstream or Transwarp Drive have yet to be perfected, so everyone gets to just use good old-fashioned warp drive, where they get around the laws of physics that say you can't move faster than light by just distorting space-time, because space-time can move as fast as it wants. As demonstrated by Voyager, warp travel is quick, but not that quick in cosmic terms. Trek being Trek, they try to explain everything they can, so then they can, ignore their own rules later when the plot needs them to, but whatever. We have a scale, so we're going to use it. The warp scale goes from warp 1 to warp 10, with warp 1 being exactly light speed and warp 10 being infinite velocity, where you occupy all space in the universe simultaneously, and then you evolve into a salamander and make babies with your salamander captain, and then abandon those babies on some unknown world thousands of light years from Earth. The highest warp factor we tend to hear about much is warp 9, which is a whopping 1,516 times the speed of light. You can get into the warp 9.99 kind of territory too, but calling that out gets kind of cumbersome, and pulling those kind of speeds are actually pretty dangerous, at least if you sustain them for any length of time. But all that said, at warp 9.99 you're getting about 7,912 times the speed of light. In short, warp travel is way slower than hyperspace travel. Fortunately, there are a few perks that they get in exchange. For one, warp is actually useful mid-battle and doesn't have much wind-up time. Things like the Picard maneuver are possible, which can provide massive tactical advantages mid-battle, and, in a pinch, Federation ships can just go to warp at the drop of a hat and get away, because the speed isn't that fast and it's relatively linear, so you can just be like, go that way for a while, there's nothing there, it's fine. Additionally, Federation sensors and weapons all work fine while at warp because you're not actually leaving real space. Torpedoes in particular are set up to be fired and continue at warp, and eventually phasers get similar treatment as well. Finally, let's talk about the sublight speeds of the ships on each side. Here's where things get significantly more speculative, since in space the only really thing that matters is acceleration, and the speed of light is really just the only actual speed limit. Unfortunately, acceleration numbers on the Trek side are just plain unavailable for the most part, and on the Wars side they list everything for capital ships in megalights, which are made-up units that are more for the purposes of telling the FX guys how fast everything is moving relative to each other, rather than how fast they're actually going. What we have for certain is that full impulse, the maximum speed for all Federation vessels, is 1/4 the speed of light. How fast they achieve full impulse varies wildly depending on the ship in question, and they can technically go faster, but time distortion relativity issues start cropping up, so they keep things more reined in. Full impulse is the speed, one quarter of the speed of light. They can go a lot faster than that using their impulse engines, but the speed, full impulse, that's a quarter the speed of light, and that's pretty much standard. That's as fast as they usually go. All the ships can also maneuver at this speed, so it's not just straight line movement. What I've been able to dig up is that according to the TNG Tech Manual, when the Ambassador class, which is being developed, so that's the precursor to the TNG Galaxy class, they had a target acceleration of 10 kilometers per second squared, or 1000 G. They were having trouble hitting this target until driver coils were installed, which artificially reduced the mass of the vessel, allowing increased acceleration figures. Let me clarify that. The acceleration target for the biggest ship they had at the time was 1000 G, and then they invented devices that reduce the mass of the vessel that they're on, so really that 1000 G is a minimum. At that benchmark though, it would take the Ambassador class just over 2 hours to hit full impulse, so it's not massively outside the range of possibility for a ship that size. Something like a Defiant class, or anything more combat-oriented vessel, would of course be capable of much higher acceleration figures, and there's no reason to think that even just the Galaxy class would be significantly faster, because it's like an Ambassador, just better. On the Star Wars side, as I mentioned before, they even made up units just to be as unclear as physically possible, with TIE fighters being capable of pulling 100 megalights and Imperial 1 Star Destroyers being capable of 60 megalights. Fortunately, we do get a bit of an analog on the wiki, with TIE fighters being listed as being capable of pulling 4100 Gs, or 20 megalights per second acceleration. If we do a little math, that would mean that 1 megalight per second would be the equivalent of 205 Gs. I suppose that means that TIEs hit their maximum operational speed in about half a second. If we continue applying math to what we've done here, we end up with those megalight ratings of 160 equaling about 723,000 kph and 435,000 kph respectively, or to keep things consistent with the Trek numbers for the sake of comparison, that's 0.07% and 0.04% of the speed of light, as top operational speeds for the TIE Fighter and Imperial 1 respectively. We still have no idea how fast the Imperial 1 actually can achieve its maximum speed, and we don't get any clues about why they have such limited top speeds, though perhaps the limitation is due to the fact that Star Wars ships are still manually controlled with like a joystick, so anything faster would just be suicide. So maybe it's you can go faster and you can pull these incredible accelerations in a TIE fighter. However, don't. You'll just die. This leads to a bit of a weird situation where the TIE fighter can accelerate about 4 times as fast as the prototype Ambassador, but the Ambassador caps out about 370 times as fast as the TIE fighter and 619 times as fast as the Star Destroyer. So what do we got for a scorecard on this section? Well, on the ground, it depends on what you want to do, but for all of overall mobility, I've got to give it to the Federation, since transporters are and always will be faster than any speeder or walker. In space, no question, Imperial faster than light travel is way faster, but with the caveat that they're strategically dominant, but nearly useless tactically. I'll mention here that we do get examples of micro hyperspace jumps, but those were extremely difficult to execute and were only really successfully performed by Thrawn. We'll get more into him later. Finally, also in space, at Sublight, Federation ships are definitely faster than Imperial ships, though if they decide to throw caution to the wind, it's possible that fighter pilots might be able to catch up. But what do you think? Am I skipping over something I shouldn't? Am I misrepresenting something? Did I mess up my math? Let me know in the comments. Again, I have links to my Patreon, Coffee, and Fourth Wall in the description if you'd like to support the channel. Patreon is where I'll be hosting a discussion regarding a breakdown just like this one for a matchup between the Protoss and Eldar that I've been putting off because it intimidates me. But until next time, live long and prosper, and may the Force be with you.